Hello and welcome to our 35th podcast, man, 35th episode of Naturally Scott. I am your host, Scott Harris, and honestly, as I've mentioned before, honored to be your host. That I've gotten 35 such great guests to join us is just amazing. And today's is Christine Webb. And this one, I've said this before that this is different, but this really is. The first 34, we have covered different animals. And today, while we're discovering more about a particular animal, that animal is us. We're going to be talking about human beings today, and that's what Christine's book is about. She is an assistant professor of environmental and animal studies at New York University, having recently joined there after having been at Harvard for a while. And she is the author of a book called The Arrogant Ape, a book I should point out, by the way, that her mother named. Her mom came up with that name, which I just think is so cool. But the Arrogant Ape is us. We are the Arrogant Ape. And she talks about that and explains why she believes that to be true, the damage that is caused, and how we might be able to right that ship in the future. It's a brilliant work, shakes up the scientific community, I believe, and I think that anybody that has a real fascination and an interest and a love and a passion for nature will find Christine's book to be thoroughly enjoyable. It tackles, even attacks, the concept of human exceptionalism. That is the idea that human beings are above and beyond all other things in the world, all other animals and plants, and that all of those are put there for our benefit to be used as we see fit. And Christine counters that and says, no, that is not the case. We are one of many, and we should treat ourselves and others like that. I think you'll find the book fascinating, find the conversation fascinating. And when it's done, there is a field notes on the bonobo, a type of ape, one that I'm very unfamiliar with, but learned a bit in order to do the field notes. So stay tuned, listen to Christine, enjoy this, and my email's at the end, man. Let me know what you think. Thank you. Bye. All right. Welcome to Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris. I'm happy that you're here. I thank you and appreciate every single time that you guys listen. We've got a fun one today, a little bit different, an interesting subject to talk about. I've got Dr. Christine Webb as my guest. She is a Harvard primatologist, and we're going to talk about that and find out exactly what that is. But before we do, I want to throw out a thank you to one of my favorite guests, Cy Montgomery. Cy was a guest in my book, Why We Love Birds. She's been a guest on the podcast. She's coming back on the podcast. We're doing a women in birding podcast in January with 3 women who have been birding for 50 years plus. And we're going to talk about how the birding world has changed for women. And Cy is one of those. So I'm really excited about that. But she's the one that introduced me to you. She's the one that I think she was doing maybe doing a review of your book or something, but she was doing something related to your book and said, hey, you've got to have Christine on as a guest. So I'm thrilled that we have. We are going to talk about your book. Obviously, it's just been released. There's a lot going on with that, and I do want to cover that. But before we get there, let's go back just a little bit. One, I want to share with you this. Since I've read your book, and I was fascinated by it, and I appreciate your people sending it over to me, your book has probably shown up on a half dozen of my podcasts where it was appropriate to bring it up during the podcast. I threw the cover up, mentioned you, and it has really been a little bit of a consuming thing for me. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and it had me thinking about a lot of things. And I know it's going to do the same thing for the guests. But for those who are meeting you for the first time, take us back a little bit to your path to animal behavior, primatology, Harvard, maybe even start with your childhood. Let us know how you got from there to here. And then we'll talk about here.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. And thanks also to Cy for connecting us. I'm very appreciative. Going back to my childhood, I, like many children, was always an animal lover. I was always so curious about other species and who they were. I identified with them as individuals. I wanted to know what they were thinking and feeling. And that never really left me. But when I started university, there were some courses offered in my concentration. I was a psychology major in animal behavior. And I was very lucky that I happened to land at a place where these courses were on offer, because as soon as I took my first animal behavior course, I fell in love with it. It was like doing something serious, but actually something that I just loved and felt very playful and returning to that sort of childlike sense of connection. And there was also a very well-known primatologist at my university, Franz de Waal. This was at Emory University. And I took a course with him called Primate Social Behavior that really opened my eyes to the lines that we draw between humans and other animals and how those lines are really precarious. All of the data he was showing, all of these amazing videos of chimpanzees and other primates doing things that I had long thought were only things that humans could do. And I was really moved by that. And then you combine that with a longstanding love for evolutionary theory, which I always had in high school. I read On the Origin of Species from cover to cover, which I didn't do that with all the books I was assigned to read. And I was just really fascinated by this notion that we are connected to all other forms of life through common origins. And I think if you combine that love for other animals with a love for evolutionary theory, plus getting this exposure to primatology during my undergraduate education, you get to primatology as a discipline because there are other animals, but the field is also really interested in evolutionary questions, and particularly this: what makes us human? What makes us different from other primates? What do we have in common with them? And fast forward, I did my PhD in psychology, kind of continued to work on questions both in understanding human behavior and animal behavior, chimpanzee behavior, and then ultimately landed at Harvard, where I was doing a postdoc and teaching courses in human evolutionary biology. But now I should mention, I should have updated my bio before. I've actually just started a new job at New York University, and I'm in an environmental studies department, which has an animal studies branch. It's a very interdisciplinary group looking at human animal relationships, how we relate to the living world and the rest of nature. I would say where I have ended up is no coincidence in terms of the content of the book. And I'm sure we'll be getting into that a little bit more and why I'm now in an environment.
Well, that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the new gig. I hope that it's everything that caused you to make the switch. I do want to back up just for a moment. You
Yeah.
mentioned Darwin and evolution, and coincidentally, tomorrow evening I'm interviewing a gentleman named John Van Wy. John is one of the world-renowned Darwin experts. He's based in Singapore, University of Singapore. And so, well, I'm interviewing him tomorrow night. He's being interviewed Wednesday morning because of the time change. But I'm excited to have him on board and explore that more. And I've got a trip coming up to the Galapagos with my wife. So what we're talking about now, what I'll be talking about with John tomorrow, and then the trip to the Galapagos, this is all fantastic. And selfishly, it's why I do the podcast.
Yeah.
I get to
Lucky
meet
you with
fascinating people
Galapagos.
and learn things.
Lucky you getting to go to the
Pardon?
Galapagos. That's going to be incredible.
Yes, I'm absolutely thrilled about it. I just interviewed recently a gentleman named Taylor Butts, who's probably been to the Galapagos, I don't know, 15 or 20 times. And then I've got an interview coming up with a gentleman named Kevin Laughlin, who leads worldwide birding tours predominantly, but he just took his
Wow.
50th trip
Yeah.
to the Galapagos.
I mean,
So I'm
yeah.
getting all the, it's hard
Oh
to
man,
imagine I have to
I've
wait
been
till
once.
September
I almost said I've only
before I
been
get to
once,
go.
but I've been once, and it was enough richness of memories to sustain me for the rest of my life. So it's an incredible experience. Yeah.
I can't wait. I can't wait. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. So, was there during all of this and leading up to writing the book, was there a moment, was there an epiphany moment where you thought, maybe this isn't all about us? I mean, most of us were raised that there are human beings and then there's everything else. And obviously, we'll get into that in depth. But was there an epiphany moment where you thought, maybe that line's not as hard as we've been led to
There have
believe?
been several epiphany moments. One is the one I opened the book with, which was a time when a desert Chacma baboon taught me something very surprising. His name was Bear. He lived in the Namib Desert where I was doing field work during the summer. And he was a juvenile at the time. Juvenile male baboons tend to do is causing some disruption within his group, but also with the team of human field researchers who were following him every day. and kind of testing his boundaries, playing tricks on us, like jumping, on our backpacks, jumping out of bushes and surprising us. And so he was causing some issues. And one day though, it kind of escalated and got more and out of hand. So I was in the field with a colleague and we weren't sure exactly what happened, but all of these baboons surrounded her and they started to bark and scream and slap her legs. They were kind of mobbing her. And we weren't sure, again, what had catalyzed it, but Bear was clearly involved and it was clear he had kind of, potentially instigated this event. She was fine in the end, although just very scared. And so was I. And the next day, we actually decided, we thought maybe we shouldn't continue to follow this troop anymore, just give it a break. But instead, we decided to continue to follow the troop, but at a greater distance and to be more vigilant. And so the next day, I was with the same troop. I was following them on foot, and at one point was in a pretty vulnerable position. I was kind of wobbling down this steep rocky incline, and of course at that very moment all of a sudden I see Bear and several other young baboons marching towards me, and I thought, okay, this is a problem because I can't easily get out of their way and they're clearly making a beeline right towards me. And I just tried to remain as calm as possible. They got closer and closer. I couldn't really, again, move out of their way. And as Bear approached, he got right up next to me, closer than he'd ever been. And he puts his hand in between my hiking boots and he looks up at me and he bares his teeth into this very awkward, forced grimace. And I remember it so vividly because I just thought, oh gosh, his teeth are so white. I've never seen baboon teeth this close. How are they so white? They look like dentures. They were just like perfect square teeth. And he bared his teeth and then he moved on. And it was a very surprising and kind of pivotal moment in my career because as a primatologist, I know that that gesture is something that baboons do to appease one another. It's a submissive gesture that they do to signal their friendly intentions. And in that moment, I knew that Bear knew what I was feeling, right? He knew that I was afraid, even though I was trying to hide it. And I believe he also knew why, which was because the day prior, the incident had gotten out of hand and gone too far. And he saw that we were keeping our distance from the rest of the troop and thought, okay, maybe that did go too far. And he was trying that requires the capacity to know not only what I'm feeling, but what I know. This is something scientists call a theory of mind, the ability to know what another individual knows. And during my graduate training, I had learned that theory of mind is something that humans and only humans are capable of, that this is one of these cognitive Rubicons that separates human from animal. And as is the case with many of my epiphanies, the animals taught me otherwise. They showed me something that they were capable of that I had learned or thought that they were not. And not only did he show theory of mind for another individual, but for an individual who's a member of another species. And that really, I guess, was one of these moments where I thought, okay, I have some things I need to unlearn.
That's fantastic. I'm going to interject. I'm going to go from I want to ask you a question. So, I wrote a book called Raptor Quest, and I spent a year
Hmm.
chasing the 53 raptors in the United States. It's a fantastic experience, found all 53. Third was a northern hawk owl, and it's a beautiful bird if you're not familiar with it, just stunning bird. And I had found it the afternoon before. There were a couple other people there, and we watched it for a couple hours, and I got some pictures, and it was great. It was sub-zero, it was cold and snowing. And I went back the next morning, and there was nobody else there. It was just me, and the bird was in the same place. And the bird was on the top of a telephone pole across a 15-foot wide dirt road. So it's an unused telephone pole 15 feet away. I got out of my car, worked my way back to the back quarter panel of the car. So I was kind of leaning against the trunk, left my camera in the car. I just wanted to experience the bird. The bird sat on the pole for 2 hours. It preened and looked at me, but it didn't do anything, didn't hunt, didn't leave. Suddenly, after 2 hours, it dropped down toward the road. And when it got a foot and a half off of the road, it turned and came straight across directly at me and with its left wing brushed my left leg and then flew away over the prairie. And I spent 2.5 days trying to find it again, and I never could. I've talked to a handful of people. I can't think of anything other than spiritual for a reason the bird did that. And I don't know how that might possibly fit into the theory of mind. There's no way the bird didn't know I was there. I mean, I'm 6 foot tall. I'm over 200 pounds. I've been standing there for 2 hours. There's certainly no way. I mean, the bird could have avoided me going
Yeah.
any of the other 359 degrees when it flew away. And it chose to touch me and then continue flying off into the prairie, never to be seen by me again. Do you have any thoughts on why the
I don't
bird
know
might have
enough
done
about
that?
like raptor behavior to know what that gesture, that touch means, even amongst conspecifics. I would be really curious. But what is clear to me is that they saw you as another individual in their environment, right? As someone who would be responsive in some way, right? You weren't just some object or thing in their environment, but that you were an experiencing subject and would have some, experience of what they were doing to you. And what is so amazing, I've been getting emails from people. This is one of the greatest things about writing this book that I was not anticipating at all, but I've been getting emails from readers with their own encounters like this. And people have encounters with so many different kinds of animals that they have a very hard time explaining, right? And sometimes they invoke a spiritual explanation. At the very
Mhm,
least, they're invoking kind of a mentalistic one where they're, what was this animal thinking? How did they perceive me? And it's been such a delight to read all of these stories, and it makes me realize
mhm,
something that I think I already had a sense of, at least within the scientific community. It's true that many scientists who spend their day in, day out living and working with other animals also have these kind of unexplainable relationships and encounters, but maybe it's a bit taboo in the scientific community to talk about them. I think it's also taboo in the dominant culture to talk about them, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so thank you for sharing your version of this. I'll add it to the list of very beautiful encounters that I've heard about since writing this book.
well, and it was for me, and I mean, I'm 68, I've spent my whole life outdoors, I've had encounters with animals before where I thought there was a little bit of a bridge, but this one to me was just spectacular. I mean, I don't wanna say I've struggled because it's not disconcerting to me in any way, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about that moment and that animal. And then when you were telling your baboon story, and my wife and I just got back, well, not just, that's a fair to say, it's a year now, but we spent a few weeks in the Serengeti with some friends who we actually met in Amsterdam on our way down to Africa. And, so we spent some time with baboons there in both Kenya and Tanzania, and not nearly at the level that you did, of course. It was just simply a safari. But nonetheless, as you watch these animals, you see that there is an engagement with us that goes beyond one supreme
Hmm.
being and all, inferior beings. And obviously that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So if I if I understand the way that I read your book is I saw a blending of biology and traditional science and philosophy, and then on into indigenous perspectives and some epiphany moments that you've had. And all of that seemed to be leading you away from a lot of what
Yeah.
let's call traditional science, right? Where very structured, very rigid, we don't name animals, boom, bada boom, bada boom, and all these different things. And you shared in your book how you were schooled in that, but it changed over time. And was it this blending of, let's say, simplifying it to science and philosophy that kind of led you to explore something that's
Yeah,
pretty
I think
different than most
your
people have
reading
explored?
of the underlying message is absolutely correct. I'm glad that came through. And it was
Loud and
o-
clear, I must say. It's not that I'm overly
okay. So I'm
perceptive.
not subtle about it
It
then. Well,
was it's
that's
very
probably
evident
okay
in the
too.
book.
The blending of science and philosophy and other fields, right, was certainly a part of that process of me questioning what I would call the dominant scientific paradigm. And that I was lucky, during my postdoc in particular, I had a lot of freedom to explore other fields and literatures. I got really interested in history and philosophy of science, indigenous sciences, just was able to read a lot more than I had previously. And my world kind of opened up, right? Because a PhD, you're just narrowing, and becoming an expert on one topic. And then suddenly the world opens up again. And I would say alongside just my own exposure to interdisciplinary literature, it was really meeting other scientists who had the courage to question the way that things were being done. A group of other scientists, all of whose work I talk about in the book: Barbara Smuts, she's a primatologist; Becca Franks, an aquatic animal welfare scientist; Monica Gagliano, a plant scientist. I got together with them and we really started to give each other permission, I would say, to question the conventions of the governing scientific paradigm. And it was through those conversations with each other that I think empowered me and to some extent, maybe all of us, to really start to speak out about some of the ways in which the way that we're doing science is not only ethically problematic, but it's also limiting the science. So even if we don't care as much about the ethical issues, which are paramount to me and to those who I was just talking about, even if you don't care about those, though, if we want to do good science, then we need to be thinking about other approaches that, for instance, take animals' perspectives and interests very seriously, as opposed to labeling a concern for those perspective and interests anthropomorphic or biased or somehow not parsimonious. So and then the third aspect of this was the other animals themselves kind of teaching me otherwise and teaching me to rethink some of the assumptions that I had.
Okay.
Hmm.
The 3 people that you
Yeah.
mentioned, were they all women? Do you think there's something to that? Do you think it's more than a coincidence that you and the 3 who inspired and supported
I
and
don't think it's a
motivated you were all
coincidence.
women? Do you think that's
No,
possible?
I think, but
Or is it
I should also mention that at the same time, my
you
mentor,
don't?
who also allowed me to explore these different fields and different approaches to science, Francois, was a man and super supportive of it. So it's not to draw some kind of hard line here, but I don't think it's a huge surprise. I mean, science has the kind of gatekeeping that has happened in science over the years and the way that the field really began, right? It was dominated by men, and to some extent, in the natural sciences in particular, still is. So if you're going to be challenging a conventional paradigm, right, it would typically be people who might not be who might be operating a little bit more on the periphery of that, and who therefore have had to come up with other ways or different ways of thinking about things. And that is a part of the reason, I would say. I think about Jane Goodall as another great example. The you know very recently late and great Jane Goodall, who, along with several other women primatologists, did approached other primates and the study of other primates in a really unconventional way, in part because they weren't trained in the conventional paradigm. So Louis Leakey chose Jane Goodall to go to the field, in part because she didn't have experience. She was a secretary. She wasn't a PhD student at Cambridge like many of the people he sent there. So there was something about
Mhm.
that, fresh perspective as a result of not being part of the scientific establishment that allowed her to relate to these chimpanzees as individuals and to really learn things about their lives that she might not have otherwise.
And Cy Montgomery wrote about that in her first book, and I'll throw the cover up here on the thing. And then I wonder, and then we gotta move into the book here actually, because that's what I'm most excited about. But is there something to be said? I mean, I understand there's supposed to be no differences between men and women, but there are. And I think it's reasonably fair to say in
Mm,
general that women can be more empathetic than men. And as women have made headway into the scientific community, and we've gone from this, these are subjects, they're
mhm,
not primates, they're not in any way equals, and we don't
right.
even bother to name matter of fact, we don't even allow people to name them. And now suddenly you bring a lot of women into the field. And it seems to me that one
Yeah.
of the motivating factors might literally have just simply been empathy. You talked about at one
Hmm.
point where you walked through a lab filled with primates and
Hmm.
nearly broke down in watching what was happening.
Yeah.
A lab that
Yeah.
hundreds of men have walked through before. And I wonder if you think I'm just if I'm
No, I think there's
creating
something to
something
that.
out
And
of nothing, or
regardless
if
of
you
whether
think
we
there might
chalk
be
it up
something
to
to that.
biological differences in empathy or different socialization practices, right? I think it must be a combination of both, as with so many things. But, there's even been studies looking at in early childhood education during dissection modules, for instance, at gender differences and how both girls are reacting to having to do this dissection compared to their boy classmates, and how they're getting socialized by teachers differently when they have a reaction that is either, disgusted or upset by having to do this. And so I think the empathy, the sort of difference, this difference in empathy that you're highlighting is something that, especially in science, right? It could begin from a very young age and be reinforced through these different socialization processes that happen. So I think it's a very important topic, and one I definitely get into in the book. But I feel like there needs to be more on this. We need to study not only, right, the sort of gender gap in science in general, but like what does that therefore mean for the science that's done? Not just the existence of it, but like what are the implications of that for the way that
Mhm.
science is done and for what we consider to be good science? I think it's so important.
Well, I would agree. So let's really dive into the book. I mean, we've gone around the edges because I wanted to meet you and learn about you, but I'm absolutely thrilled with the book. The cover is up on the screen as we talk. The title is The Arrogant Ape. And let's start with that because it's a provocative title, and I imagine purposefully so because it draws attention to the ideas and to the book, which is great.
my
Where and
mom,
why and how,
my
where
mom
did the
came up,
arrogant
my
ape
mom
come
came up
from?
with it.
Where did that title come from?
Yeah, I owe
Pardon?
her. I owe her. Yeah. So I
Your
was
mom
texting
did.
with her. This was years ago when
That's
I first started my job at
fantastic.
Harvard. I was given a lot of flexibility to teach whatever course I wanted. And I knew I wanted to teach a course about human exceptionalism because I was in a human evolutionary biology department where a lot of the research is focused on, okay, what makes us human? And typically answers to that question will focus on some kind of positive characteristic. It's our ability to, establish cumulative cultures. It's our ability to hyper cooperate with each other, to manipulate and control the environment. All of these generally what is kind of seen as positive or advanced characteristics that make us human. And I wanted to challenge that in a course that I wanted to sort of provide a foil or counterpoint to that. So I knew I wanted to teach a course about human exceptionalism, and I was texting with my mom, what could be some good names for this course? I was explaining to her the ideas, and she wrote back, "What about the arrogant ape?" And as soon as she wrote it, I was like, "Yes, done." I mean, this is now going to be, and I also had the idea I wanted to write a book already about these topics, but that especially solidified as I was teaching the course. And I think even just having, the title for the course, it was very clear that this could become a book with a strong and provocative title. So that's where it began.
Well, congratulations, mom. That's a neat story. That's a great story. Well, I'm going to pull a card out of order. I have these cards with questions on them that I like to ask, but you've touched on human exceptionalism, and that's a huge topic in your book. So tell us what it is and where maybe you
Yeah.
and
So
others are pulling away from what has been a long held view. I mean, in generic terms, we always just talk about opposable thumbs, which turns out not to be true. But for the layman,
right.
that was always it, right? If nothing else, we've got opposable thumbs. But it turns out we're not
Sure.
even unique in that.
Human
So tell us
exceptionalism I
what human
define as
exceptionalism is
the belief
and
that
where you
humans
pull
are
away and
somehow
differ.
separate from and superior to the rest of nature. And it's important to differentiate something like human exceptionalism from human uniqueness, although they do have quite a lot in common historically, in particular, that whatever quality we thought made us unique also made us, somehow more advanced or more morally worthy. But human exceptionalism is different from human uniqueness because I'm not wholly opposed to this idea of human uniqueness. I think that it's possible that humans have qualities that set them apart from other species. I would just note, or maybe I should say, I'm okay with certain arguments in that regard, but I would just note that historically attempts to define some kind of stable human essence or nature have either included members of other species, right, as you were saying with like the supposable thumbs, or excluded an array of humans, often those who are already marginalized and discriminated against in our society by some way. So
Okay, so
that sounds
Christine,
good. And
one of
I
the key
don't have a hard
components,
stop at 11,
and it
so
might
I'm
be
just fine
argued
to go
the
a little
key
bit
component
over
of your
if
book,
that's
is
okay.
the idea of human
Yeah.
exceptionalism, something that most of us have been taught since birth, that human beings are above and beyond everything else in the world, that plants, animals, the earth itself is all here to serve us. And that, again, as a kid, we were always taught, if nothing else, opposable thumbs were the differentiator between us and everybody and anything else. But you would argue that that may not be the case, that humans may be unique, but that all plants and animals are unique in some way. And so each of them can make that same claim. Well, we're the only ones that ta-da. And so talk to me about human exceptionalism, your thoughts and philosophies about it, and the scientific community, and and if that's something that has changed over the years.
Yeah. So I define human exceptionalism, as you said, as this belief that humans are somehow separate from and superior to the rest of nature, and that there's a lot of overlap with other terms like human supremacy, anthropocentrism, even this notion of human uniqueness, but that in some ways these are all slightly different. And I chose human exceptionalism for a reason, which I'll get to. But this notion that humans have qualities that set them apart from the rest of nature or have unique qualities that no other species has, this idea of human uniqueness has a fraught history because either those attempts to define that, stable human essence have either included members of other species who exhibit said capacity or excluded an array of human beings who lack that capacity and often, or who are thought to lack that capacity. And those are often the humans who are already marginalized in our society in some way, shape, or form. And so human uniqueness is different from human exceptionalism in that human exceptionalism suggests that what is distinctive about humans, what is unique about humans, is somehow more evolutionarily advanced or morally worthy than the distinctive features of other forms of life. Because indeed, if we want to follow a narrative of human uniqueness, we could say that all species are unique in their own right. But human exceptionalism kind of takes that one step further and says, okay, whatever distinguishing characteristics that humans have somehow make them
And
better than other
that's
species
the
and
big
entitled
leap,
to
right?
use the earth
Is we
and
can believe
other
that
forms of
that
life for
we're
their own
unique as a
exclusive
species.
use.
We can even believe we're morally superior, although there are a lot of arguments against that. But the leap is so everybody and everything else is subservient to us.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually the sense in which I mean morally worthy, not like have moral systems, which I think you're right. Many other species seem to have moral behaviors, moral, even norms and versions of morality, but that the distinguishing characteristics that humans have somehow give them more moral priority to make other forms of life and nature subservient to serve their interests and their needs. And human exceptionalism has a long history. Some people trace it back to the agricultural revolution, the beginning of domesticating other animals and plants, and how that kind of relationship to nature preconditioned the human mind favorably towards ideas of human exceptionalism that came later in Aristotelian thought, other dimensions of Greek and Hellenistic philosophy, this idea of a ladder of life, right? Where humans are at the top, followed by the animals who look the most like us, followed by, reptiles, birds, fishes, plants, and fungi, all the way down to inorganic or inanimate matter. And that idea, which Aristotle called the scala naturae, the scale or the ladder of life, seeped into Christian thought in what is known as the Great Chain of Being, which was a very similar hierarchy, except in this case, humans weren't at the top, but God and angels and spirits were at the top. And humans alone were able to kind of straddle the world of the immaterial gods with the material animal bodies. This idea, I mean, again, I could give a whole history lesson about then how it gets taken up in Enlightenment thought and the Renaissance. But one of the main points I'm trying to make in the book is that this notion of a hierarchy has not left us today, despite Darwinian theory, which is like there's no scale of life, there's no hierarchy here. It's more like a tree or a web of life. But despite, the Darwinian revolution, there is still a persistence of hierarchical, human exceptionalist, anthropocentric thinking in our culture today, and even within our sciences. And so while I think there's growing attention to the ways in which human exceptionalism continues to shape our culture and our sciences, I think a lot of those conversations are happening in academia. Like there's a lot of interesting academic work on anthropocentrism, human exceptionalism, but those
So you
ideas
talk about the
hadn't
fact that
fully
this is now
reached
being
the wider
discussed
public. And that was one of the main
in
reasons why
the
I wanted to
academic
write
level.
this book.
You have the hard sciences, but then you came up through philosophy. Is philosophy leading this charge and then kind of bringing that to the hard sciences, or am I oversimplifying?
I think it's a conversation between the two because, I mean, philosophy also has an incredibly anthropocentric history. Philosophers for hundreds of years were not at all interested in other animals because and I'm talking about the sort of dominant Western philosophical tradition. I'm not talking about all philosophers, but just like other fields of study within the humanities, right? It's humanities. It's focused on human ideas and human histories. And if humans are alone are thought to have minds or to be capable of rational thought, these are the kinds of questions that philosophers are interested in, right? They're interested in understanding minds and how those minds work and understanding the sort of moral systems that emerge from those minds. If humans alone are thought to have those capacities, then philosophy is not a field that has necessarily traditionally concerned itself with other forms of life. And so I think it's driven by a conversation that is happening across fields where science has generated evidence of four animal minds, right? But then also still has these norms and values that they're not really sure, always hyper aware of. And philosophy is really good at then bringing some of those underlying assumptions and norms and values to light. And because of the scientific evidence, they've perhaps opened, their field a bit more to understanding not just the philosophy of humans, but the philosophy of animals, understanding animal minds and their subjective experiences. So I think it's a conversation between those things. And then I think it's also very much been driven by shift in public perceptions of other animals and our relationship to the environment. There has been a lot of pressure from the public to rethink maybe the way that we're doing science, particularly
So
animal
I want to
testing,
talk
right?
about
So I
animal
think that
testing
those
because you
sort
do
of
talk about it a
broader
lot in the book, but
sociocultural forces
in your
have also
answer,
played a major role.
you differentiated Western philosophy with I guess Eastern philosophy would be the flip side of that. This conversation that is happening, this potential shifting away from the idea of human exceptionalism, do you see this happening worldwide, or is the forefront of that occurring in Western thought, or how are you seeing that?
hmm So I would say that the shift away from human exceptionalism does seem to be primarily happening in Western thought, but that is because Western
So
thought
so this was
was the area in which this idea really, really took off and took hold. So that there's actually a need for there's some there's some schools of philosophy and plenty of human cultures around the world, past and present, who never have necessarily endorsed this kind of hierarchy between humans and the rest of nature. And so they don't have there's not like a revolution that needs to occur or that is occurring away from these
Okay.
ideas in those fields, because
And
they
you
never
you
adopted
in
them
your
in the
book,
first
you
place
explore some
in
of
those
the
cultures.
indigenous
And
tribes and their
yeah,
thought processes. And if I remember right, those in general, those were not strongly held human exceptionalism beliefs, right?
yeah. I mean, there was this experience in writing this book and in kind of working with colleagues to rethink the way that we're doing science that was very humbling for me, because a lot of what I thought was kind of the leading edge of science, right? That we're going to start taking animal interests seriously, their perspective seriously. We're going to rethink this detached, cold, neutral scientific observer and instead really focus on, how we can empathize and engage with other forms of life and how that actually promotes the science and makes us understand them better. I mean, I could go through a very long list of all of these, what I would say like sort of tenets of a different way of doing science are that I'm advocating for in the book, and then say that, well, none of those ways are so very new at all, but rather they're grounded in much older traditions, including indigenous ways of understanding the rest of nature. And so I do in the penultimate chapter in the book, I go through a number of different indigenous scholars' work. I tried very much to kind of tell the stories and share the scholarship and the science in their own words rather than my own, because it's, of course, not a way of knowing that I was brought up in. I'm very much a part of the dominant Western culture. And it was such a wonderful and humbling experience for me, because again, so much of what I thought was kind of new and cutting edge has existed for so much longer. One of my favorite examples in this regard is how Jane Goodall, right, who made these incredible discoveries into chimpanzees' worlds and societies. She's often credited with discovering certain things like in their tool use and their cooperative hunting behaviors, but actually, um, local African communities knew about these behaviors and reported them to European colonists hundreds of years prior. I think in the 1500s, there's documentation in the ethnographic record that indigenous communities knew about these behaviors. And so again, it's just one example among many of how I think science today is maybe waking up to a lot of facts
Okay.
and approaches
Well,
to studying
tell me
nature that
about
are not so
weird humans
revolutionary.
and bizarre animals, which is something that shows up in your book, and weird and bizarre might mean something different than the audience
Okay.
immediately
Yeah,
would have
good.
thought of. But go ahead and share that with us if you would, please.
Mm. Yeah. So WEIRD is this acronym that stands for Western Educated Industrialized Rich Democrats. And the acronym was coined by Joe Henrich and colleagues. Joe Henrich was in my former department at Harvard, to make this point that the vast majority of what we know about human psychology comes from weird populations. So it's highly biased, and typically psychology studies are done on, you know, undergrads at elite, universities in the US. And then we draw conclusions about human psychology based on that very small and unrepresentative sample. And, the idea is that if we really want to make any kind of universal claim about human psychology, we need to widen it. We need to zoom out from a weird perspective. And this idea has now been adopted in some animal behavior circles to highlight the fact that not only are the humans that we often study in research unrepresentative of humanity on the whole, but the other animals who we study in many research contexts are unrepresentative of their species on the whole. So bizarre, oh gosh, I don't even remember what everything stands for, but the B is for barren and the I is for institutionalized and zoo, rare rearing environments. So the idea is that the vast majority of what we know about other animals and their cognition comes from captive environments. So in my field, chimpanzee cognition, I'm a, comparative psychologist. I have that training under my belt. So in comparative psychology, people tend to focus on the cognitive abilities of humans and compare them with the abilities of chimpanzees. side by side. But the problem with those kinds of comparisons is that you're typically studying chimpanzees who are bizarre. They're raised in highly restricted, man made environments. They lead deprived lives when it comes to social and their physical and social environments. If we draw conclusions from those studies about human uniqueness because humans outperform chimpanzees on certain cognitive tasks, we can't draw conclusions about species differences. Also, because the humans tend to be highly unrepresented, they tend to be weird humans in these studies, so they're not representative of humanity on the whole. And yet, there is a tendency to draw conclusions about species differences based on these highly unrepresentative samples,
And do you
very
see that
biased ways of
shifting? Do you
studying
see that there's
other
a
animals.
move away from that? I mean, as I read your book, I tried to imagine, well, it's not hard to imagine, but if you dropped a 2-year-old human infant off in the middle of the Serengeti, they wouldn't last an hour and a half. And so it seems
Yeah,
so logical and obvious when I read about it and when you're explaining it now that even setting aside the arrogance in measuring them against
yeah,
the things that we value and that we consider important, setting them up in that situation, it'd be like measuring an athlete, but you tie their hands behind their back and say, okay, show me how you catch a baseball. Well, I can't do that with my hands tied behind my back.
yeah,
And so is that shifting? Are you seeing, I guess in a bigger question I want to ask you, do you feel like the thought process that you've had and you shared in your book, is it making headway in the scientific community? Are you getting pushback from traditional scientists? Which I always consider a good sign, by the way. The more pushback, the more excited I get. So tell me about how that idea is being integrated.
yeah, yeah. So I do think that there is a growing number of people who are questioning this way of doing science, both again for ethical and scientific reasons. But at the same time, it's still going on, right? There are still primate cognition labs in the US and many other countries, and these labs are still publishing quite a lot of work in prestigious scientific journals. There's also the entire field of biomedical research, which is also founded on the idea that the rats or the fishes or the monkeys who you're studying in these highly deprived social and physical environments are somehow representative of like a healthy norm, and they're not. So it's not just in primatology, but in research involving other animals in general. I do still think that I know that there is this is acceptance of this kind of work because it's still happening. That's not to say that there aren't many more people like me who are rethinking it and questioning it. But I just want to add that I think part of the reason for the the fact that this work is ongoing is because of the way that human exceptionalism has seeped into science. And it's because of human exceptionalism that people would overlook the fact that this very harmful environment affects the psychology of the animals you're studying. If we assume that there's some kind of hierarchy and that only humans are really affected by their environmental experiences and other animals, it doesn't really matter. A chimpanzee is a chimpanzee, no matter where they're from. A rat is a rat, no matter where you find them. Then we're not going to take seriously how these different socio-environmental circumstances are affecting the cognition and the psychology and the overall health of the individual. So I think it's one of these ways in which I say seeped into science because I think it operates in a pretty insidious way. I think it's kind of this bias that is everywhere and nowhere all at once that it's kind of hard to see because it's so normalized and yet once you do see it, it becomes so evident why it's problematic. But I mean, I'll speak for myself that, even for many years, despite how obvious some of this now seems to me and to you, it wasn't entirely clear to me. I was working in a primate cognition lab myself and trying to understand their minds in a context in which I realize now is totally impossible. But it was so normalized. It was what we all did. And then that affects, our perception of the
And
situation
some of the
and
testing
why
that's
the
done on
work that
these
we're
animals
actually
has to be
doing.
considered torture. I mean, it just does. And it seems to me that the only way that we can
Yeah, for
accept
sure.
that in our minds is to view these as subhuman. And you don't bring this up in your book, but I'm going to throw it out there
Correct.
and we can skate by it or we can talk about it. But that's the exact same similar mindset you have to endorse slavery. You have to take the people that you're enslaving and say that
Yeah.
you are subhuman, because otherwise, I don't think that the human mind could accept what was happening.
Hmm.
I don't think that that's something. I think we would explode. And so we just say, well, no,
Hmm.
blacks or Jews or whatever are subhumans. Whatever we do, they're here to serve us. That's the way it goes. And it seems to me that there's a parallel in that thought process with torturing rabbits or rats or primates, whether it's, let's say, to try to find a cure for cancer or simply to develop a more pleasant cosmetic. Do you see any parallels in that, or am I grasping at straws here?
No, absolutely. I think people sometimes get a little bit upset when you compare animal cruelty to other humans. It sometimes makes people really uncomfortable. I believe that discussing the parallels and common roots of these different forms of discrimination are so important. And there's a growing number of other scholars who are also recognizing the links between speciesism, right, or discrimination based on species membership, and many other isms in our society, racism and sexism and ableism. And for me, the way I approach it is that, okay, well, in talking about these different forms of discrimination in parallel, we don't need to, we're not directly comparing the unique experiences of their victims or trying to rank these different forms of discrimination somehow, but we're trying to understand how they operate in a similar manner. And what you're already saying is exactly right, that they're in an exploitative relationship. One way of, I guess, managing whatever dissonance could arise in harming another sentient being is to say, oh, actually, they don't really feel this, or they don't feel it as strongly as they would if they were fully, human. And it's not just that. It's not just about, oh, they're not experiencing pain or they're not harmed by these harmful practices, but it's also like they're not as intelligent. They don't have reason or rationality, so they can't even think about this. They don't have culture, right? And when you look at the ethnographic records, at the ways in which colonists talked about the the people they colonized, it was like they don't have intelligible language, they don't have culture, they don't have religion, they don't have reason or rationality. When of course the people who they were encountering had their own forms of all of these things. They just looked in some cases maybe unrecognizable to the colonists, or again there was this like motivation to undermine or underestimate or erase those capacities in order to do great harm. And so it's so important to be able to talk about the ways in which dehumanization, this sort of like who gets to count as human, and all of the parallels, right? All of these things that we've historically denied to other species too, like language and reason and culture. It's been a tactic of
Do you have a
dehumanization
word that
historically as
parallels
well for towards other
dehumanization?
human groups.
Because dehumanization works when we're talking about, let's say, slaves or what happened to the indigenous people here. But what is there a parallel word for other primates or
Yeah.
octopus or rats or rabbits? Despeciesization, maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, well, in some ways, it's not a great term because we're
Okay.
animals too. But I see dehumanization as a form of animalization, right? We're rendering them animal. Not that that should be animal should be. When people say that I'm an animal, I'm like that's a compliment. But in the sort of dominant rhetoric, it's not right. Like, oh, if you describe someone as an animal or a rat or a pig, it's not a compliment. And so there's this discourse of animalization that's part of dehumanization. So I would almost say, like, when we're just talking about other animals, we're also animalizing them, which means reducing them to instinct and, undermining their capacities. I don't like that word means that. I wish we could sort of reclaim the word to animalize someone, and that it's not a bad thing at all. It's actually just making us become more aware of who we
And
truly
maybe
are.
another book.
But yeah, that's a
What
separate
is the
conversation.
differential imperative?
Yeah, right. The differential imperative is a term coined by the political scientist John Rodman to refer to the Western propensity to define humanity by setting it in opposition to animal. So the way that we define what it means to be human is by giving ourselves a characteristic that other animals lack. And historically, the reason he called it an imperative is because there have been so many different terms and capacities put forward as this feature that defines humans in opposition to other animal. We've already talked, or I've already mentioned a bunch of them: rationality, language, tool use, culture, self-awareness. I mean, it has gone on and on. And he called it this imperative because it's almost this compulsion, this need to differentiate ourselves and continue to switch the goalposts when one capacity is found in other forms of life to then erect a new hypothesis, a new capacity. It's this imperative to define ourselves in opposition to other animals to enable
And do you think that's what drives that
harm and
imperative?
exploitation.
Is it's that belief in our exceptionalism or our uniqueness is required in order to do some of the things that we do?
Yeah,
So
I do.
what happens,
And I think that was the
let's
point
say
that he
that
was
your
making.
view, one that I share, let's say that your view becomes the pervasive view.
Yeah.
How does that shift things? What happens now to animal testing, to cattle ranching, to fishing and hunting? How does that manifest itself in societal change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have to mean radical shifts in many of our current practices, probably paramount among them, factory farming, right? Where there's so much exploitation and so much lack of honoring, the lives of the individuals who are caught up in these systems. I think it would mean a shift to alternatives to animal testing in scientific research, which is already a growing conversation, in part because of the existence of alternative technologies and because of the replication crisis in science, where people are kind of questioning the ways and we're doing this. I mean, people have even kind of blamed the replication or the translatability crisis on the fact that, animal models are failing us. And I think that's in partly because, the way that we're studying them and the assumptions we're making about them, such as they're embodying healthy biology and psychology, are false, right? If we take seriously their subjective lives. And so I think it's both this sort of cosmological mindset worldview shift that needs to happen, but then I also think the availability of alternatives, right? Plant-based meats or alternatives to animal testing. I mean, there's versions of this in every category. The existence of those alternatives will also help us shift away and enact some of these principles. So I think it's both. We need the sort of material changes in our
Okay.
society and
All
also the
right.
mindset
Tell
shifts.
me about, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Umwelt? 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 So talk to me about that.
Umwelt.
Explain to the audience what that is. I've written down some examples.
Yeah, so the Umwelt, it's a German word that means environment, and it was coined by phenomenologist Jakob von Uexküll to describe the sensory world as experienced by an individual organism. And so, we're primates, you and I, we're visually dominant. We experience the world primarily through our eyes, but for most other species, that's not the case, right? So dogs primarily navigate the world through their sense of smell. So if we really want to get into a dog's umwelt, we should imagine, okay, what is it like to be seeing the world through our noses? And questions into that experience, again, are what Jakob von Uexküll meant when he was talking about umwelt, and also really important to science because we need to be designing studies, understanding other animals on their own terms, and not through a kind of human-centric umwelt or the way that
And you gave
we
some
tend to
examples,
navigate
and
the world.
I think the audience would be curious about catfish you talked about.
Yeah, so they basically taste their surroundings. So I don't even remember how many tens of thousands of taste receptors that they have on their body, but basically it's like imagine swimming through the water and just tasting everything around you. I guess the one of the famous examples, right, is bats and dolphins navigating through echolocation, but as a result of that process, dolphins swimming towards you could probably perceive like it's like they're like an X-ray. They could perceive your internal, your bones inside of you because they're able to hear, the sound reverberating back. There's so many amazing examples. Owls, for instance, have this incredible sense of hearing. And I write about in the book this encounter that I had with an owl in Namibia who was always sleeping above my tent. And every morning when I would wake up, my eyes would open and she would immediately peer down. And she was quite far up in the tree. And so I always thought, gosh, what an amazing sense of sight that she has. And it's true that owls also have incredible sight. They can see much farther than humans can. But they also have this incredible hearing. So they can hear the heartbeat of a mouse who's like 20 or 30 feet away from them. And so now, and when I think about that owl in the canopy above me, I'm like, I wonder if maybe she was also perceiving changes in my heartbeat as I was starting to wake up. And now whenever I see an owl, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, can they hear my heartbeat? And they probably can. So, I mean, and there's incredible examples of other animals having sensory capacities that we lack entirely. So not just better hearing or smell or sight, but actually, they can detect magnetic fields, or they have platypuses have electroreception. So they combine touch and the capacity to sense electric currents into kind of one.
Birds being able to
There's just
migrate thousands of
endless
miles.
version.
You know, I have to
Yeah,
share with the audience star-nosed moles. You mentioned star-nosed moles in your book. I don't think many people spend a lot of
stardust.
time thinking about them, but go ahead and share their umvelt.
Yeah, they're, I think, functionally blind, but they have these incredibly sensitive snouts that can basically. I think I have a really interesting statistic in the book that like concentrated in, their snout, they have like imagine like thousands of hands in terms of the sensory sensitivity of their snouts. And so they basically are able to navigate their environment with these highly sensitive tactile snouts, even though they're functionally blind. And they live underground. So that's another really important sense in which the umwelt, it's shaped by the needs, the evolved needs and environments of the organism in question. And so would it be very useful for a star-nosed mole to have excellent sight? No, it wouldn't, because they live in
Well,
near
I think that's
darkness.
fantastic. And as we're drawing to a close, and by the way, I would very much love to have you back on the show again when your schedule settles down, because there's still so much to talk about. If nothing else, even in this umwelt thing, antelope and harlequin mantis shrimp and other
Yeah.
raptors, and there's just some fun stuff that you brought up. But you do talk in your book about kanzi. So I'd like to give you a chance just to
Mm-hmm.
talk about that as we wrapped up,
Kanzi.
because you wrote with some emotion about that.
Sure. So Kanzi was a bonobo who actually has passed away
Oh, I'm
since
sorry.
I wrote the book. So nice to be able. Yeah, he lived at a ape language research center in Des Moines, Iowa, and he was very famous. He was part of this kind of tradition of language trained apes where he learned to use a lexigram system, which is kind of like a keyboard of arbitrary symbols to refer to particular objects in his environment. So he was trained over many, many years to use this lexigram to communicate about novel entities in the environment. And I write about him. I write about a particular incident where I Skyped with Kanzi because my teaching assistant in a primate behavior class I was teaching at Harvard did research at that language center and had connections there. And the students were really interested. They finally got to Skype with a bonobo and see some of the research that they were reading and learning about more up close and personal. And I share the story in the section of the book where I'm asking, okay, do other species have languages, right? One of these hallmarks of human uniqueness has been language. And so do other forms of life have language? And there's an incredible, again, growing body of evidence in many songbirds and prairie dogs and many other forms of life that show, no, they have language. It just looks different, sounds different from ours. But it's, again, you can even think about, language that occurs in other sensory modalities through olfactory a communication through chemical cues, right? Could that be said to be a form of language? And it struck me in writing that section about all the different languages that exist around us that maybe we don't even fully recognize as language, but they are indeed languages in their own right. That the experience that I had Skyping with Kanzi was really bizarre. And I remembered it being feeling like it was a bizarre experience at the time, but I wasn't totally sure why. And I think reflecting back on it and then that longer tradition of ape language research, it's really because what we're doing in those cases is trying to teach other animals human language, right? We're trying to see, okay, can they use human words? Can they use human grammar systems? And can they learn to speak like humans? And that may be interesting in its own right for particular reasons, but it's not actually asking do other species have the capacity for language. It's asking a much narrower question, which is like, can they learn our language? And simultaneously, kind of on the flip side, there's a lot of interest and investment right now in trying to decode or translate animals' languages using
Mm.
AI. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's all of this attention going towards, okay, are we going to be able to learn other animals' languages by just using these huge algorithms and recording all of this different, sounds that they make? And I similarly have concerns about that for a number of reasons, but in part because I think of language not as this thing in the world, this capacity, this faculty. I think of language as a participatory process, right? I have a 13-month-old daughter right now, and
Congratulations.
we're communicating, and thank you. And she's using language, I'm using language, but it's an entirely participatory, co-created way. And so if we really want to understand what other species are saying, yes, it might be better for us to try to learn their languages than to force them to speak ours, right? That might be better. But I think even better would be for us to develop our own new shared languages, which is how people develop language
Mhm.
over time, right? So we're not just trying to translate theirs in this very abstract, like detached manner, which is how these new technologies are promising to do it. And we're not forcing them to learn ours in this kind of artificial manner, but we're figuring out, okay, can we? And I think a lot of people who live with companion animals, right, who live with dogs, for instance, have already done this in some ways. They have a new shared language. Maybe sometimes they're using human words. Maybe sometimes they're using made up words. Maybe sometimes they're using gestures. They're using particular tones, ways of speaking to each other that is shared and specific and totally understood and its own form of shared language. So I'm really interested in those approaches, sort of as a antidote to the great ape language studies and this
Well,
experience that I had
I
Skyping
think
with
you're
Khan.
100% right, and if you view language in the way that most people think of language as simply a subset of communication, then all of the other things that you mentioned, the
Yeah.
olfactory and the all of the different things that the different ways that that we communicate differently with each other. I mean, but also other animals and whatnot, and even plants communicate with each other, mycelium and whatnot. Then you start to think, yes, there are all those levels of communication. And I mean, my early training as a very young man was in marine biology. And I used to wonder frequently, how frustrated are
Okay.
dolphins that we can't learn their language? They've sent representatives to
Yeah.
SeaWorld and they've tried for years to teach us, and we just can't get it. I mean, it is very
Yeah.
human exceptionalism based to assume that all other
Totally.
beings need to somehow understand not just human language, but in general, specifically English. That that is
Yeah.
that is
No.
the measure of
Yeah.
intellect. Anyway,
Yeah. Carl Sagan has a great quote about that, by the way. I think I put it in the book, but it's like he's talking about how it's noteworthy that other animals have learned to use human language and can speak up to, 100 English words, but that no human has learned to speak Dolphinese.
yeah,
Like he uses
it's it's
and
it
that's
is.
true.
It's a
We have
great
this.
quote, and I think it's important. So as we wrap up, and I do not mean this
Yeah.
question to be trite or cute, but in your thought process, are there people who believe that the collective world might be better off if humans weren't here?
Yeah. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who believe that. I don't necessarily believe that. I think there, again, are so what do we mean when we talk about humans, right? Are we talking about modern industrialized humans, weird humans? Are we talking about humanity on the whole? There's so many different ways of being human and manifesting as human. And so yeah, I guess to sort of make a categorical statement about humanity in that respect, in terms of how we relate to nature and how we treat nature, I wouldn't endorse.
Well,
And then I think it's like, it feels like a cop out in some ways too, where it's like, well, then we don't have to learn how to really be in a humbler relationship with other species. We're just removing ourselves, harder, but I believe more interesting and also more leading to more diversity in the world, right? Would be to keep humans here, but have us figure out a better balance, a way of coexisting and living in balance with other forms of life. And I think that's really, really challenging, if not nearly impossible.
well,
But I also love human. Despite the title of my book, I think humans have a lot to offer
well,
too, right? Just like every
I would hope
species
you
has a
think
lot to
that
offer. I
since
think
you
we
have a
do.
13-month old daughter.
Yeah, I think humans do. We can do many beautiful things. We have many beautiful things we can contribute, many gifts we can contribute to the world. It's just how can we do that, in a way where we're not dominating. And if we can figure that out, then yeah, I wouldn't need to write this book.
Or whatever the follow-up might be. As we're wrapping up, I'm gonna throw my email up here. If anyone's got questions for me, please send them. And if you've got questions for Christine, I can get them to her and we can do that. But Christine, if there was a single takeaway, and I do not mean to oversimplify a very important and very complex book that you've written, but for the non-scientist, for the
Mm.
layman, and almost everybody, it might be everybody who watches this show except maybe your mother and your friends, they're all going to be naturalists at some level. They're going to be birders or hurt people or whatever. What's the takeaway? What's the one thing you would want them to walk away with, having watched this, other than encouraging them to read the book, which I do? But what if somebody read the book? What would you want them to do with that when they're done?
I mean, I guess my takeaway would be that a world beyond human exceptionalism is worth imagining. And there are ways that we can do that in our daily lives, right? It comes down to the way we talk about other forms of life, the language that we're using, the rituals we engage in, the kinds of work we do in our professional lives as well, right? I think people can start where they are. If you're a scientist, you can think about how to remove this anthropocentric bias from your work. If you're a lawyer, maybe you could think about how to represent the interests of other species in your legal advocacy and work. Again, I think if you're a musician, you could think about writing songs for other forms of life or in collaboration with other forms of life. I think that there are the takeaway would be that there is a world beyond human exceptionalism. It's worth imagining because it's better for other forms of life. And I think it can be an incredibly enriching experience for ourselves. And no matter where people are, what professions they're in, there's a way in which they can try to fight this bias, to highlight this bias, to recognize it, and to counter it. And there's so many. I'm a scientist. That's what I wrote about. But there's so many different areas and ways in which this can be challenged and changed.
Okay. So this next question, the last question, may not be fair. So dismiss it if it's not. But for a woman with a 13-month-old daughter who just published a significant book and just changed jobs from one excellent university to another, you may not be thinking at all about what's next. But if you are, what might it be?
Yeah, there's a couple of ideas next. One is I would love to be thinking seriously about the ways in which nature, other forms of life have already, they've been innovating for millions and millions of years. How have they already figured out solutions to the climate crisis that humans could then apprentice themselves to and learn from? So
My God,
I'll just share for now.
that's fantastic. I will look forward to that. I ask my guests at the end of each show to please pick a book to recommend to the audience, anything that is nature based or even nature adjacent. And I'm curious what your recommendation would be.
Yeah, many to choose from, but I will pick, especially given our conversation today, Gregory Kahiti's Native Science. It's one of these books that I was reading. I had mentioned earlier in the conversation that all of these new ways of doing science are actually rooted in much older traditions. And in Gregory Kahiti's Native Science, he writes a great deal about the main components of indigenous sciences. I mean, he looks across many different indigenous worldview and relationships, and tries to kind of identify these certain commonalities. And it's a wonderful book, super instructive, and I recommend it certainly to all scientists I know, but also to the wider public. It's a really beautiful book and accessible.
Well, that's fantastic. It's not a book I'm familiar with, but I will familiarize myself with it. The cover will be up on the screen for those of you watching this on YouTube, so you can take a peek at it, and hopefully some of the audience will buy that. Christine, I don't know if you know, but following each of my podcasts, I do something called field notes, where I pick one plant or animal or park or something, and just look up some information and share it for 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm going to do the bonobo after this. And so that will be the one that I highlight. At the end of these, I so much want to say thank you, Christine. I loved your book. I enjoyed the conversation. I hope this isn't the only time that we get to speak, but this has been fascinating. What's your daughter's name? I wish you all the best with your daughter.
Her name's Vera. Thank you.
Oh, what a beautiful name. Well, again,
Thanks.
congratulations. It kind of puts everything in perspective, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Yeah.
So as I wrap up every show, I do the same thing, which is to tell people, get outside as often as you can, see and experience as much as you possibly can. And when you're doing that, stay safe and stay curious. Christine, thank you so much. Have a spectacular day.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for the great questions. I really enjoyed it.
Hello and welcome to Field Notes. This is the 35th episode of Field Notes, and today we're going to talk about bonobos, which are sometimes known or used to be known as the pygmy chimpanzee. But they are a primate, and this Field Notes is following a podcast with Christine Webb, the author of The Arrogant Ape, and she spent some time with bonobo, and I thought it would just be kind of neat to follow up and do this. I didn't know much about them. I would say almost nothing about them. So we're going to learn together. They are part of the genus Pan, P-A-N. Bonobos and chimpanzees are the only two members. Bonobos used to be a subspecies of chimpanzee. Some people contend they still should be, but nonetheless, they are now separate species, but same genus. They are the two closest human relatives, or two closest species to the humans. The bonobos and the chimpanzees are cousins to each other, and in some ways, cousins to us. We share 98.7% of our DNA with both the bonobo and the chimpanzee, which is kind of cool. Now, the bonobos are more slender than a chimpanzee. They have longer limbs. They have a narrower chest, and they have a rounder head. So there are physical differences. They are only found in the rainforest south of the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So it's a small area that they live in. Males get up to about 100 pounds, females up to about 75. They both stand just under 4 feet, closer to 3.5 feet tall when they are standing. They are unusual among primates. They are a matriarchal society. They are a highly social structure. There are strong female bonds, and that leads to, or is thought to lead to, cooperation to maintain group cohesion. The females actually use a greater variety of tools than the males do, which is kind of cool. They spend their time in the trees, most of it. They eat fruit, and they will travel in between trees. They'll finish up the fruit in one tree and then drop down to the ground and travel across and go to another. They go back into the trees at night. They make nests out of leaves and branches, and they actually use leaves as blankets or hats when it's raining. Now, conflict resolution sometimes is through sexual causes or through sexual activity, both hetero and homosexual. It is thought to reduce tension, resolve conflict, and reinforce the family values of the tribe, if you will. The primatologist Fran DeWall has stated that the bonobos are an altruistic group, compassionate, empathetic. They show kindness, patience, and sensitivity, traits that we'd like to see more of us as humans having, which would be kind of cool. They are important for forest ecology, especially because they eat so much fruit as they travel between the trees. There is seed dispersal, and that leads to some more trees. They are endangered, not surprising, because they have such a small area, and that is due to habitat loss, human encroachment, hunting, and poaching. which are the things that are affecting so many of our species around the world, not just primates, but just about everything. And it is a horrible thing to see. Because the Congo is not politically stable, there has not been a tremendous amount of research that is able to do down there. Frankly, it's just dangerous for the researchers to spend a lot of time in the Congo. So we don't know as much about these magnificent animals as we should. Now, there is one famous bonobo, Kanzi, lived from 1980 until just earlier this year, just died in March of this year, 44 years old, was a male bonobo, and learned our language through keyboard lexicons and mastered more than 350 words and actually picked all of that up. They were trying to teach his mother, and she was not very successful at it, and Kanzi picked that up. And it was said by some of the researchers that worked with him that he might have understood 1,000 different English words. Anyway, fascinating species of animal, and I hope you get a chance to see them, although that's most likely to be in zoos, and there are quite a few zoos around the United States, at least until things settle down in the Congo, or someday perhaps when they spread out their geography a little tiny bit. Thank you so much for listening to us today. Really do appreciate it. I'll throw my email up, send me a note, send me questions, whatever you've got. I'm happy to answer them. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or any of the podcast platforms, thank you for doing so. If you're watching us on YouTube, reach over and click that subscribe button if you would. No cost to you. And every time somebody additional subscribes, YouTube pushes our videos out to more people, which means that more people are learning about nature and some of these different things. And we're also able to invite more and different guests. So it's a bonus. And, drop a comment, click like, whatever you want to do. And as well, I like to wrap up every show and get outside as often as you can. And when you do, stay safe, stay curious, and enjoy the bonobos. Have a great day. Bye.